Have you ever wanted to grow this part of your forearm? The part of your forearm that probably makes it look the biggest? If you have, this is the video for you. I'm going to tell you two major things. One is the anatomy of these muscles so you know where they are, what they do, and how to train them. And then two, I'm just going to show you exercises, right, based on that information. So first and foremost, we have two kind of major muscles to think about. One is kind of a group, one is a muscle alone. So the first muscle that we need to consider is called the Brachioradialis. It's represented by this green band here. And it attaches down at the bottom, what's known as a radius bone, and it runs up and onto the bottom of the upper arm, known as the humerus. And its main function is basically just to bend the elbow, but more specifically with what we call a neutral wrist position. So a neutral wrist position, if I'm standing here, is not one where my palm is turned all the way down and not one where my palm is turned all the way up, but somewhere right in the middle. And when the forearm is in this position and you go through something like a curl, many of you probably already recognize this as a hammer curl, that muscle, this big bulk on the top, is going to be really well trained. Now this muscle can contribute to some degree to rotating the forearm, but the relative amount of involvement of this muscle in forearm rotation is a lot lower compared to just elbow bending. Now the second muscle, really group of muscles, are what I like to call the radialis muscles. This is just a fancy way to say basically the muscles that kind of sit underneath into the slightly sort of outside portion of the forearm, which basically contribute to the bulk that this thing creates. But those muscles, although they do technically cross the elbow, right, they attach upward on the sort of bottom of the upper arm here, they don't really bend the elbow. In other words, they don't take the hand and bring it upward in this direction like this muscle. But what they do is called wrist deviation. And these muscles run from that point on the sort of side of the upper arm there, all the way down on the side of the forearm through the wrist. So they actually cross the wrist like my fingers are orienting right now. And so what that means is that they bend the wrist in this direction. And this motion in and of itself is known as radial deviation. And this is the kind of motion that you create if you're going to sort of cock your wrists backward, like in this direction, if you're going to, you know, throw a fishing line or something like that. So now we have these two major categories of motion for growing this particular area. The first one is basically just a elbow bending motion with that wrist again in that neutral position. And the second is basically just a pure wrist motion where we're trying to deviate that wrist in that sideways direction. So now practically speaking, here's how we can break this down very simply in just two exercises. The first exercise that I would recommend is some kind of hammer curl. Many of you are probably familiar with this kind of motion, but any kind of hammer curl, i.e. any kind of curl where your wrist is in that neutral position, is going to be fantastic for training the brachioradialis specifically. And because of the fact that you're in that neutral grip position, you'll actually get some force imposed on that wrist bending motion that we were just describing. And so if you were going to pick either one of these two motions or categories of motions we're about to describe and talk about, it would be this curl variation, right? If you only have time for one or you only want to add one, I would choose this one because you're training both those categories. You're training the elbow bending element of it, but then your wrist is sort of getting turned downward toward the floor by the dumbbell that you're using or the cable that you're using, such that you'll also be training those wrist deviator muscles. And then the second category of motion, as I mentioned, is just this wrist deviation thing. And so there are a bunch of different ways to do this. I personally really like to do this with a rope. And what you can do is just sit down on the floor or standing up, you can just go through those wrist deviation motions. Now, a really important feature of this exercise and a really important feature of setting it up is to make sure that your elbows aren't getting taxed a lot, right? Because especially if you've already just done a curling variation, you don't want to like be fatiguing other muscles like the biceps and the brachialis muscles. But what you do want to do is you want to put an anchor, or what I like to call an anchor, somewhere along the forearm so that you can basically just create a block for the wrist to move, right? This is no different, let's say, from doing something like putting a thigh pad down onto your thighs during a leg curl motion so that you can actually just curl with your hamstrings rather than having to fight the resistance with your hips the entire time, right? Same thing applies. We're stabilizing here so that the elbow and the shoulder don't really have to encounter much force and so that we can just move through wrist motion. So overall, for growing this bulk of the forearm, forearm, we have those two major groups, the elbow bender muscle, the brachioradialis, and then the ones that sit basically next to and underneath of that one, which I like to call the radialis group. And these are muscles that perform mainly that deviation motion. So choosing one exercise for a couple of sets, that's more of a neutral grip curl, and then following that up in sequence with something like a wrist deviation exercise, that's going to be a nasty combination that undoubtedly is going to tax this part of your forearm very specifically, unlike other exercises that you may have tried in the past. If you're really interested in all these concepts and just the basic biomechanics that underlies everything I'm talking about, you're really going to appreciate my beginner biomechanics course. It's basically meant to fast track your learning in just 30 days. You need no experience understanding any of this stuff. You can basically go from zero to hero in less than a month. If that sounds interesting to you, check the link in the description to see more information about my beginner online biomechanics course.